Welcome to another slow descent into the dusted vaults of forgotten history, where kings and queens do not shimmer from pedestals, but drift like veiled shadows through chambers of soft perversion and candlelit cruelty. A king's body was both mortal and sacred, both flesh and symbol. He was expected to rule with justice, to pray with humility, and to produce heirs with vigor. What was called sin in the church could be called spectacle in the court. In some courts, the bedding ceremony was public, partially staged for witnesses to confirm consummation. Festivals, masquerades, banquets, and hunts all served as opportunities for staged indulgence. In France, the Valois kings hosted banquets that included erotic performances, masked dancers, and delicacies shaped like genitals. Charles II of Navarre, known as Charles the Bad, was said to host night rituals involving masked orgies and poison tests. The eroticism of his punishments, whether exaggerated or not, reflected a deeper belief in the sacred theatre of suffering. Gilles de Rais, who fought alongside Joan of Arc, became infamous, not for his battlefield bravery, but for the alleged black masses and child sacrifices in his chateau. Some were cruel, some were mad, some were lonely. The histories they left behind are often written in layers of judgment and myth. It is our task here not to peel them away entirely, but to gaze through them, softly acknowledging the strangeness without needing to explain it all. The royal bedchamber was never simply a room. It was a theatre, a courtroom, a temple, and sometimes a tomb. It held within it the weight of nations and the silence of secrets. And tonight it holds us in quiet observation as we begin this strange descent into the lusts of crowned heads. His trial blurred the line between satanic myth and aristocratic depravity. Yet whether all the charges were true, or some were shaped by envy and superstition, his legend remains a testament to how power can decay into nightmare. Whether these stories were entirely true mattered less than the fact that people believed them. The court of Catherine de' Medici included the so-called Flying Squadron, a group of beautiful young women trained to seduce political targets. Some accounts suggest they were accompanied by handsome young men for the same purpose. Seduction was strategy, bodies were tools, and desire was a currency more flexible than gold. Edward II of England, whose affection for peers stirred both gossip and rebellion, reminds us that love, too, could be dangerous for a king, especially when it did not conform to expected roles. He became a symbol not of just sin but of chaos. In contrast, rulers like Henry VIII managed to contain their lusts within the frame of legal authority, marrying and divorcing, executing and promoting in the name of dynastic necessity. But even then the whispers persisted that Anne Boleyn was a witch, that Catherine Howard was too eager, that lust and death were one and the same at the Tudor court. In England, masks often contained allegories of desire draped in classical myth. The line between art and arousal was never fully clear. Even sacred holidays were not immune. The Feast of Fools, the May Day rites, the Saturnalia echoes, all provided temporary license to invert the moral order. And when kings joined the inversion, it took on a dangerous thrill. In others, it was a site of soft power, where favorites rose or fell according to how well they pleased. When Philip IV of France accused the Knights Templar of sodomy and ritual sex, it was not merely a charge of blasphemy, but a political maneuver to seize their wealth and dissolve their power. The same tactic was used by inquisitors against female mystics, by reformers against queens, and by rivals within courts. In this way, the narrative of vice became a currency, one that could destroy or protect, depending on how it was spent. Some rulers required their mistresses to dress as boys or to act as servants. Others preferred confession before climax or flagellation afterward. The practices varied, but the themes remained. The crown gave permission to desire without restraint. A king who kept many mistresses might be scolded by the clergy, yet adored by his nobles for his virility. A queen who enjoyed power over her lovers might be slandered in sermons, yet praised in whispered poems. Royal sexuality was often theatrical, carefully staged to affirm power status or lineage, but it also crept into darker corners. When desire was mixed with paranoia, with boredom, with madness, it became strange, and in some cases it became cruel. But what he did behind the drapes was rarely as pious or productive as the scribes suggested. Some kings viewed their sexual power as a divine extension of their authority. Others viewed it as private recreation. A few turned it into ritual. And yet among all these men and women of power there is a thread of indulgence that binds them across centuries. Not always cruel, not always vile, but nearly always unchecked. Tonight we begin a quiet journey through the folds of silken chainmail, where royalty indulged not only in feasts and bloodshed, but in lusts shaped by divine right and unchecked power. This is the story of rulers who wore their crowns not only on their heads but deep within the folds of their desires. This is not a tale of pornography or scandal for its own sake, but a quiet contemplation of how lust and power have always clung to each other like damp skin beneath velvet robes. In this series, we drift through the blurred edges of sin and sovereignty, where what one man might call sin, another called ceremony. What one woman called shame, another called divine command. Let us begin not with judgment, but with observation, breathing softly into the forgotten spaces between throne and bedpost. Let us listen to the whispers of the chroniclers, the monks, the painters, and the poets, who each in their own way told half-truths and riddles about their kings. Some praised too loudly, others condemned too gently, but all of them knew that behind every crown lay a history of want. In medieval Europe, the bodies of rulers were not entirely their own. To the medieval chronicler, the decision to record a king's vice was never simple. A royal historian employed by the court could not afford to be too honest, unless that honesty served a greater moral narrative. Sin could be recorded if it ended in repentance. Perversion could be written if it ended in divine punishment. But indulgence for its own sake could only be whispered or hinted at. This is why many of the most lurid royal tales come from outside the palace walls, from foreign diplomats, scandalous letters, gossiping monks, or enemies with a moral axe to grind. These outsiders were freer to accuse, and sometimes more eager to exaggerate. The line between truth and tale was not always firm, but patterns emerged, and patterns revealed truths deeper than names or dates. The term vice itself is slippery in the medieval context. Take, for instance, the notion of the royal bedchamber. More than a place of sleep or sex, it was a stage where politics and pleasure blurred. And it was not only in the bedroom that royal vice revealed itself. Sometimes the perversion was not simply indulgent, but strategic. Sexual shame could be a weapon wielded against enemies. There were also rulers whose sexual lives blurred into the grotesque knot, because they were particularly worse than others, but because they lost control of the narrative. In some cases, the perversion was not an accident of power, but its expression. Vlad the Impaler ruled through fear and ritualized violence. It is also worth noting that not all royal vice was heterosexual or confined to men. As we drift through these stories, let us not forget that behind the scandal lay real people with real skin and breath and fear. Charles II of Navarre did not earn the name Charles the Bad because he was particularly unkind or especially incompetent, though he was often both. He earned it because something about his rule drifted so far beyond the expected boundaries of noble cruelty that even in an age that tolerated kings who starved peasants or burned heretics or warred against their own sons, Charles managed to make people uneasy. Born in 1332 to the royal house of Evreux and crowned King of Navarre, in 1349, he ruled in the shadowy interstices between France and Spain, between holy war and civil war, between allegiance and betrayal. He was neither consistently loyal to the French crown nor fully rebellious, instead weaving a labyrinth of intrigue. Frustrated even the most seasoned diplomats. But the shadows that stretched across his diplomacy were nothing compared to those rumored to stretch across his bedchambers and banquet halls. One chronicler hinted that Charles used a method of punishment that involved tying the body in a way that produced pleasure and pain in alternating waves of practice. He claimed to have learned from Arabic manuscripts. He reportedly maintained a private torture chamber disguised as a wine cellar with iron hooks, beneath the barrels and racks painted to resemble shelves. To him, there seemed no contradiction between attending mass and orchestrating orgies, between praying for his enemies and poisoning their sons. He once ordered a feast to commemorate the death of a rival, during which the meat was shaped into the forms of human limbs and served by naked dancers whose identities were concealed even from the guests. He plotted to have Charles V of France assassinated, then denied it with such persuasive sorrow that many believed him. The same herbs he had once controlled began to warp his skin and his breath. According to Jean Froissart, the chronicler who loathed and yet could not look away from Charles the Bad, the king had grown so ill that his physicians decided to wrap his body entirely in linen soaked in brandy to stimulate warmth. Monks muttered prayers against him, and nobles erased him from tapestries. Yet in the darker corners of folklore he remained, as a figure of forbidden wisdom, as a whisper beneath the castle stairs, as a reminder that power taken too far becomes indistinguishable from madness, and that in the right hands a crown is not a symbol of virtue, but a license to rewrite the laws of desire. But when one of the attendants approached with a candle to seal the cloth, the alcohol caught fire. When every appetite was indulged, when fear and lust danced in silence behind stone walls, He was not the only ruler to mix poison with pleasure, nor the last. But he remains one of the most haunted, and as we drift further into this tapestry of royal vice, we carry his shadow with us through each candlelit corridor. The king was burned alive in his own bed, screaming for hours as the room filled with smoke, and no one dared come near. It may have been an accident. It may have been murder. It may have been poetic justice. Whatever the truth, it was a death that suited the man. Wrapped in opulence, suffocated by secrecy, devoured by his own devices, he suffered from seizures and hallucinations and fits of rage that left rooms shattered. He spoke in riddles. He claimed to see angels, and once insisted that a deer had told him a prophecy. Yet even then he held power. People still feared him, and perhaps they pitied him too. He funded rebellions and then betrayed them. He built alliances with poison and broke them with sex. His court became a theatre of masks, where no one trusted anyone. But everyone danced just the same. The wine was thick and dark, and some claimed it had been spiced with something not found in any vineyard. The purpose was not merely to extract confessions, but to observe the limits of the body under pressure and to discover which combinations of fear and arousal might render the soul most malleable. He could be charming and eloquent and brilliant. He quoted the classics and composed verse. He kissed babies and gave alms, and on more than one occasion he saved the lives of children who had been sentenced to death. He was not a cartoon villain. He was a man who believed in beauty, and who believed that beauty could be coaxed from the most unlikely places, even from the edge of cruelty. There are records of complaints from monks who claimed to hear cries beneath the cloister during the king's visits, though no boders were ever found. Another spoke of young pages trained to behave like statues until summoned into sudden movement during a ceremony designed to imitate the resurrection. Whether these things truly occurred or were the fever dreams of frightened courtiers matters less than the fact that the rumors spread with such persistent heat that they shaped the king's image across decades. But it was not only his political games that disturbed the chroniclers. He desired control over life itself, and in particular the power to undo it silently. Poison fascinated him, not just as a weapon but as a form of invisible artistry. He kept a personal apothecary who was rarely seen in daylight, and who some claimed spoke in dead languages. His gardens were said to contain plants not native to Navarre or even to Europe, and his library included volumes with spines, made from skin too soft to be animal. He experimented not merely on enemies, but on prisoners and perhaps on lovers. One tale describes a woman found dead with lips blackened and pupils wide, who had last been seen drinking a silver goblet of wine beside the king. Her death was ruled an accident, her name forgotten, her likeness removed from all paintings. It was what he seemed to enjoy when no one was looking, or perhaps when everyone was. Even in childhood there were murmurs. He was clever, too clever, with a memory like wax and a temper like acid. He learned quickly that knowledge was power, but poison was quicker. As he grew into adolescence, he cultivated a fascination with the invisible arts, not the divine ones, but those hidden beneath layers of secrecy and herb smoke. Invitations were issued, not with seals, but with codes and perfumes. and only to those who could be trusted not to ask too many questions. The guests arrived, masked, sometimes costumed, sometimes drugged. Music played backwards, and candles burned in colours unnatural to the eye. There were banquets, but also binding, dancers, but also silence, and there were things done on tables not meant for eating. Some claimed that Charles had constructed entire chambers dedicated to these performances, with hidden panels and iron devices, and mixtures of oils and smoke that rendered the participants pliant or ravenous, depending on his mood, the kind whispered by apothecaries at night, the kind that could cause convulsions or hallucinations or heat in the blood, the kind that made a man believe he had been kissed by angels, when in fact he had simply lost his mind. He inherited a kingdom and married into French royalty. But he did not care much for borders or alliances. His court moved frequently, his moods even more so. There were stories whispered behind stone walls, and heavy curtains of night rituals held in underground chambers beneath the royal manors. The line between ritual and punishment blurred. Some nobles who displeased him disappeared not forever, but for a few nights, returning pale and trembling and unwilling to speak. But Charles was not content with the pleasures of the flesh alone. Charles's obsession with secrecy extended even into his most violent acts. It was this obsession with mixing pain and pleasure that led some to consider Charles not merely mad but blasphemous. Still, not everyone feared him. Some adored him. Artists, musicians, astrologers, and fools found patronage in his court. His political career was equally erratic. He shifted allegiances between England and France during the 100 Years' War, using charm and blackmail in equal measure. In his later years, his body began to betray him. The manner of his death is one of the most whispered about in medieval lore. After his death, his name became a curse. Mothers warned children not to lie, or else Charles the Bad would visit their dreams. Thus, the life of Charles II of Navarre becomes less a lesson than a mirror, a reflection of how far a king could go when no one was willing to say no. Edward Plantagenet was born under the weight of 1,000 years of English soil and ceremony. As the fourth son of the formidable Edward, he was not expected to rule, and perhaps that is why he seemed always slightly adrift when the crown eventually settled upon his head. One monk compared their relationship to Achilles and Patroclus, an ancient code often used to veil male desire in classical nobility. Later that evening, it was said, Edward left her alone to celebrate privately with Gaveston. A story repeated with scornful delight by those who wished to see him fall. Whether true or embroidered, it marked the beginning of a political campaign wrapped in moral outrage. Hanged, drawn, and quartered, his genitals cut off, a punishment not just for treason. The medieval world was filled with quiet expressions of same-sex affection, often coded in poetry or cloaked in monastic tenderness. It is easy to see him as foolish, soft, or blind. Harder, perhaps, to see him as a man trying to carve space for love in a world that had no vocabulary for the shape his love took. The court poetry of the time often spoke of loyalty between knights, of bonds forged in battle and sealed with kisses before war. His life reveals how royal bedrooms were never truly private, how the personal was always political, and how power made every caress a public matter. Even the architecture of his castles spoke of concealment and display, with hidden chambers, whispered corridors, and tapestries that covered more than stone. The medieval mind was steeped in allegory. Perhaps Edward's fate was an allegory too, of love in the wrong place, of loyalty misplaced, or of a man who wanted both the crown and the comfort of a hand that was not his queeness. But those were safe gestures, wrapped in armour and blood. Edward II reminds us that kings were men, and men are strange creatures of want and weakness. His reign, though fractured and tragic, was also strangely beautiful in its defiance, not of laws, perhaps, but of the world's insistence that love must always be bent into a certain shape. Edward's affections lived not in war tents, but in feathered chambers and velvet cushions. That softness offended the baron's sense of what kingship ought to be. The love between men was not unknown, but when it took centre stage in royal power, it disrupted the expected choreography of dynasty and duty. Edward's reign, for all its faults, forced the English court to reckon with how desire could shape governance, how the heart could become a weapon of state. His favourites were not just lovers or companions, they were symbols of disobedience, of a king who refused to separate his crown from his longing. But as a symbolic evisceration of the man many blamed for corrupting the king's body and reign, Edward was deposed, the first English monarch forced to abdicate. When she returned from France with Mortimer, she framed her invasion not just as a political necessity, but a moral rescue. His military failures in Scotland and political chaos were recorded in official annals, but it was the story of his favourites that endured. Ballads, plays, and poems turned him into a tragic figure or a cautionary tale. Christopher Marlowe's play Edward II, written in the late 16th century, cast the king's love for Gaveston in tragic light, making visible what had once only been hinted at. In that telling, Edward becomes a man undone not by lust, but by a world that refused to allow him softness. She was saving England from the unnatural passions of its king. Yet Isabella herself would later fall from grace, imprisoned by her son after Mortimer's execution. The wheel turned again, and the sins of passion, however defined, seemed always to return. His young son, Edward III, was placed on the throne, and the former king was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle. There, amid the damp and the stone and the echo of dripping moss, Edward was slowly erased from power and from history. His death in 1327 remains shrouded in rumour. The most infamous account, written by later claims he was murdered with a red-hot poker inserted into his anus, a symbolic retribution for his sins against masculine propriety. Most historians doubt the story's truth, but its persistence speaks to the medieval mind's uneasy marriage of justice and shame. The barons demanded Gaveston's exile, and Edward, reluctant but pressured, sent him away, only to recall him shortly after. The pattern repeated. Exile, recall, resentment. When they could no longer tolerate the king's refusal to part with his companion, the barons resorted to violence. In 1312, they captured Gaveston and executed him without trial. Edward was devastated. He wore mourning for months, and reportedly refused to speak to the lords responsible. A piece of his joy had been torn out, not by fate, but by the hands of his own kingdom. But medieval England was not ancient Greece. Love between men was not celebrated in song, but murmured in taverns, and weaponized in the council chamber. Into the void stepped Hugh Despenser the younger, a man of shrewder ambition and colder grace. Unlike Gaveston, Despenser was no flamboyant courtier. He was calculating, methodical, and entirely willing to exploit the king's need for affection. Their relationship became both more political and more perilous. Despenser was given lands, offices, and authority that surpassed even what Gaveston had held. The barons watched with growing alarm. Isabella watched with cold resolve. When Edward sent her to negotiate with the French crown in 1325, she did not return. Instead, she allied with her lover Roger Mortimer and raised an army against her husband. They landed in England in 1326 and were met not with resistance but with relief. The nobility, weary of Despenser's tyranny and Edward's enthrallment, shifted their allegiance. It was not just a coup, but a purge of something that had long unsettled the political soul of the realm. Edward's deep attachment to Gaveston disrupted the order of things. Barons saw favoritism, not only in court appointments, but in the king's very gaze. There was a sense that Edward had withdrawn from his responsibilities as husband to Queen Isabella, a French princess of no small cunning, and retreated into a velvet-draped intimacy with his favourite. It came heavy and uncertain in 1307 when the elder Edward died. What followed was not so much a reign as a slow unravelling, woven with silken threads of longing, laced with the chill of political resentment. Edward II was not a tyrant nor a fool exactly. He was simply a man born into a role too large for his heart's peculiar hungers and too rigid for the tenderness he seemed to carry for other men. There was Piers, Gaveston first, and later Hugh Despenser, names whispered in outrage by chroniclers and lords who looked upon the king. Escorton saw not governance, but something soft and perfumed and disturbingly intimate. Piers Gaveston had been in Edward's orbit since they were teenagers, both raised in the royal household. He was of noble birth, but not quite noble enough. A Gascon with charm and swagger, and a glint in his eyes that seemed to promise mischief. Edward adored him. As prince, he lavished Gaveston with gifts and titles, and when he became king, he made him Earl of Cornwall, a move that sent the barons into sputtering fits of indignation. That particular earldom had been held by royal kin and saints. Now it belonged to a man widely considered a flatterer and fop. Gaveston's presence at court was like perfume spilled over a banquet table, heady, insistent, and considered by many to be an offence to the meat and marrow of English power. The chroniclers, never entirely unbiased, wrote of their intimacy with suspicion cloaked as wit. When Edward married Isabella in 1308, Gaveston carried the royal crown at the wedding and stood beside the new queen as if he were her equal. But grief did not chase on Edward's yearning for closeness. Edward and Despenser fled. They were captured in Wales, where Despenser was tried and executed in gruesome fashion. Yet for all the scandal, Edward II was not alone in his desires. There is something oddly tender in how Edward mourned Gaveston, how he clung to dispense her despite the tides turning against him. Even Queen Isabella, who had every reason to feel betrayed, wielded her husband's affections as a weapon. In the centuries that followed, Edward II's reign was remembered less for its policies than for its passions. Today historians revisit Edward not simply to titillate or to judge, but to understand the texture of medieval intimacy. Yet under the judgment, under the ink of hostile scribes and the sharp tongues of lords, something human glimmers still. In the high halls of France, where the lilies of the royal crest glowed pale against velvet and stone, there sat a man who rarely smiled, and when he did it, was a cold thing, a flicker like moonlight passing over iron. The old ways creaked beneath the weight of coin and paper and contracts, and the king knew that power no longer flowed only through battlefields, but through ledgers and vaults. The church stood tall across Europe, its authority rivaling kings and emperors, and yet within its arms there was tension and decay. There were whispers of corruption and disobedience, and Philip heard them all carefully, quietly, with the ear of a man who had already decided what he needed to believe. He presented the arrests as a holy duty, a cleansing of rot from the tree of faith. But behind his eyes there was calculation, and behind his lips the iron taste of unpaid debts. The Templars had become too rich, too proud, too independent, and the king had found a way to strip them bare while wrapping his hands in the veil of righteousness. Like so many before him, he had confessed under agony and then retracted it. When the pain was gone, the crown called him a liar, a relapsed heretic, and sentenced him to die. The name Templar grew heavier over time, filled not with facts, but with fear and wonder. But he was also a man of his time, and his time was full of knives dressed as rosaries. In the final years of his life, Philip turned inward. His gaze grew distant, and his jaw tighter, as though he were listening to something that no one else could hear. Some said he saw ghosts, others said he dreamed of Jacques de May, standing at the edge of his bed, his charred fingers pointing his eyes, endless and empty, and the floorboards of forgotten keeps. There may still lie the bones of men who once wore white mantles with red crosses. His France was one of candles guttering in cathedrals, while screams echoed from towers of stone. The ink has faded, but the shapes remain. The Templars burned, and the king died, and the church bent, and we continue to tell the tale, not to remember, but to feel the warmth of the fire against our cheeks, and to listen for the footsteps of armored ghosts pacing through time. He loved the church enough to mold it into a mirror, and feared it enough to hammer it until it cracked. He took the sword of faith and carved into the body of Europe, and then looked away when the blood began to pool. Men who once rode for Jerusalem and now ride only through the mist of memory, their voices have faded but not disappeared. They linger in the pauses between sentences, in the shiver before sleep, in the questions we ask about truth and vengeance, and what it means to be holy in a world made of flesh. Perhaps it was guilt or merely digestion, but the king who never doubted began to mutter in sleep. The medieval world was not gentle. It was a place where holiness and horror slept in the same bed, where kings called down fire while kneeling in chapel, and where justice bent itself around the neck of power. Philip wanted a France that obeyed, a church that bowed, and a history that remembered him not as a debtor but as a hammer. And so he struck again and again until the cracks beneath him held. Their breath books would be written, scrolls copied, and tales spun until the truth lay buried under gold and paranoia. The crown had silenced the knights, but could not silence the myth. For every cathedral he strengthened, he left a monastery smoking. For every law he enforced, he left a body in its wake. There was beauty in his reign, and terror, and the two were bound together like silk and wire. For in erasing them so violently, Philip had made them eternal. He was burned alive on a small island in the Seine as the towers of Notre Dame looked on with indifferent spires. The fire lit up the dusk, and it was said that as he died he called for divine justice, that he summoned both king and pope to meet him before God within the year. His name was Philip, and they called him the Fair, not for his kindness, but for his face, which was long and pale and unyielding, as if carved from ivory or packed snow, the line of Capetian. Kings began to falter soon after, one by one, sons and nephews, tangled in war and scandal and infertility. The French monarchy would survive, but the shadow of that pyre lingered on, blackening the edges of banners and prayers. The Templars were gone, but they had left behind a silence that hummed like a closed wound. But the king pressed harder, louder, and the Pope gave way slowly like a door rotting from its hinges. A church council was called under Philip's control, and the order of the Templars was dissolved with smoke and ceremony. Some of its members were released into obscurity, broken and wandering, but others were not so fortunate. Once a band of warrior monks, swaddled in oaths and sword belts, they had become something else entirely. Over the centuries they had amassed castles and treasures and influence so vast it bent around them like a second crown. They loaned money to nobles and kings, including Philip himself, who found their debts inconvenient and their autonomy offensive. They answered to the Pope, and the Pope was a man. Philip did not trust for a king who saw himself as the second son of France. The Templars were a storm cloud too large to ignore. He was a king who loved order more than justice, and silence more than song. A man who believed deeply in the authority of his own crown and in the emptiness of others. On the 13th of October in the year 1307, a Friday, dark and crisp and etched with omen, Philip had every Templar in France arrested at dawn. Knights were dragged from their beds and chained their belongings, seized their heads, shaved their identities, stripped in the silence of monastic walls, turned suddenly into prisons. They were accused of heresy, of spitting on the cross, of worshipping idols, of obscene kisses and unholy rituals. The charges were grotesque and detailed, and came not from witnesses but from confession under torture. He ruled not with noise, but with the pressure of a closing door, one that lets in no wind, and no voices, only the final sound of the lock catching. The world he governed was not simple. France was growing, swollen with gold and blood, and the tired size of feudalism among the great religious orders of the time. None shone brighter than the Knights Templar. So he watched and waited, and when the time came, he moved. The air of France grew thick with burnt parchment and the scent of terror. Monks were bound and interrogated in darkened rooms, with the lash and the rack, their screams softened only by the stone that bore them. Philip did not flinch. Pope Clement V was caught in the web, a Frenchman himself crowned under Philip's shadow. He tried to delay, to negotiate, to soften the blow. In 1314 the last Grand Master of the Templars, Jacques de Mallet, stood before the flames, with dignity still clinging to his bones. And so they did. Pope Clement died first of disease, and Philip followed shortly after of a stroke, or perhaps a ghost pulling at his heart. And yet, even in death, they refused to vanish. Entire villages spoke of secret survivors, of treasures hidden beneath hills, of ceremonies held in whispering woods. It is tempting to see Philip as a tyrant, cold and hungry and ruthless, and he was. But perhaps he heard them anyway. The dream of power is warm until it cools. And when it cools, it chills to the bone. Philip the Fair would be remembered as one of the most powerful kings of medieval France. And yet his legacy always flickers at the edge of flame, and somewhere under the soil of France, beneath the roots of ancient abbeys, this was Philip's world, sharp and smoky, and still too quiet for comfort. And now, centuries later, the story lies like a page left open in an empty room. The forests of Wallachia were thick with fog and teeth, trees that stood like dark priests cloaked in the silence of pine and superstition. The roads were soft with mud and blood and legend, and from among them rode a prince whose name would tremble across centuries. Vlad, son of the dragon, voivode of impalement and ice-cold vengeance. They called him the Impaler, but his full name was longer and knotted with titles. Foreign dignitaries would arrive to find entire fields of the impaled thousands of bodies, slouched in silence, facing east as if staring toward the border that had betrayed them. Merchants would cover their eyes. Envoys would weep. Vlad would smile faintly and offer them wine, as if welcoming them to a gallery. In others, he is a sexual sadist, blending lust and cruelty with seamless ease. Across medieval Europe, pain was seen as purification, and blood as both punishment and sacrament. That he cared about the slowness, that he watched, that he made others watch, that in the watching was power. There is something deeply medieval about this, the belief that horror must be seen to be effective. Even in his documents, Vlad signs his name not with flourish but with assertion, not because of vampires not yet, but because of his father's title, the Dragon, which in time turned to devil in the mouths of his enemies. Bram Stoker would later feed on that name, sip from it like wine, and create a monster who seduced rather than impaled. But somewhere beneath the fangs and capes is a real man with real policies and real stakes, splintered, heavy stakes planted not in hearts, but in bodies that still remembered how to shudder. He is not a man of courtly flirtation. He is a man who stares straight into you and sees whether you will flinch. That he was cut down by enemies who did not recognize him. That his head was sent to Constantinople in a jar of honey. But his legend did not die. It lived in the blood-streaked woodlands of the Carpathians. It lived in the silence of peasants who never forgot. It lived in the letters burned and buried, in songs hummed under breath, in the fear that comes not from death, but from what comes before death. That long, slow unfurling of pain, where the body becomes nothing but message. His letters speak of betrayal and loyalty, of vengeance and honor, and yet behind them is a voice that hums with something unspoken, something with eyes that do not blink and fingers that remember how to grip a stake. He reminds us that power when untethered from love, becomes something cold and precise. That the most erotic thing in the world might not be flesh, but control, and that history, when it leans too far into fear, finds not nightmares but art. A pleasure, perhaps, in the arrangement of agony. A joy, maybe, in how a man breaks under silence. That punishment must be public to be real, that the body must confess even when the mouth does not. And in this theatre of horror, Vlad ruled not just with a sword, but with an eye. Nothing escaped his gaze. Nothing went unmarked. Even pleasure. But Vlad brought something new. He did not just use pain. He designed it. He choreographed it. And in that performance was a strange intimacy. He was always surrounded by men guards, advisors, brothers in arms. We know that some chroniclers described him as unwed, as disinterested in traditional marriage, or else wholly consumed by other forms of closeness. Some Ottoman records, written with both disdain and fear, hinted at unnatural desires. We do not know if this meant men, or pain, or something stranger. The texts are careful, ambiguous, as if too afraid to name what they sensed. In Wallachian folk poetry, he is sometimes depicted as caressing the hilt of his sword like a lover, or pressing his lips to the handle of his drinking cup in the exact place blood once rested, to impale someone carefully, to miss the vital organs, to lift them high and wait, was to enter into a relationship with them, a final, wordless dialogue. The victim's body became an instrument, and Vlad the composer. It was not about torture, it was about authorship. Their death would be his story, told without sound, repeated in the dreams of survivors. In both, he remains untouchable, his desires wrapped in velvet shadows. He is the prince who had a mistress who laughed at the number of impaled victims so. He opened her belly and showed her how many there really were. He is the ruler who accused a woman of loose behavior and impaled her on 2 stakes, one for the body, one for the soul. These stories may not be true, but they were told, and told often, and they matter not because they happened, but because they felt like they could have. One German account told of a banquet held in the middle of such a forest of corpses. Vlad ate among the dead, unfazed by the blood or the flies, and it is said he dipped his bread in the still warm bodies like one might in olive oil. This story is probably exaggerated, but the fact that it was told again and again says something else about how deeply he burrowed into the psyche of those who dared look too long into his eyes, and none of them quite caught the way he entered a room like a blade being unsheathed. Tales of Vlad watching his victims squirm, not with disgust, but with fascination, that he observed the trembling of the limbs and the parting of lips, the slow and helpless shiver of the body as it surrendered to pain, that he looked not for the soul, but for the shape of human vulnerability. These were not the stories that made it into school books. They belonged to oral legends, passed quietly from peasant to peasant like confessions shared in the dark. In some tales, he took lovers to the stake, not to kill them, but to show them what he could do. The message was always the same: your body is mine, not for love, not for pleasure, but for power. The most intimate thing, stripped of warmth and given only form. He was not mad, at least not in the sense that comforted people. He was deliberate, he was thoughtful, and he punished not because it was cruel, but because it was beautiful. To understand Vlad is to peel back layers of ash and story and look at what still glows. He was born in a world of betrayals, shaped like handshakes and treaties stained with the ink of lies, while Achaia, the narrow corridor of land between empires, was less a country than a chessboard where kings placed their knights and waited for screams. The Ottomans pulled from the east, the Hungarians from the west, and in between stood a boy who had seen too much too early. He was taken hostage as a child, not with ropes, but with expectation. Sent to the Sultan's court as a political pawn, fed with golden rice and distrust, taught to bow and smile and study the edge of steel. And when he returned to claim his throne, he did not come gently. He came with punishments as messages and messages as performances. His rule was not a reign, it was a theatre, and the stage was soaked. His preferred method of execution, impalement, was not new to the world, but he refined it the way some men refine poetry, a sharpened stake driven carefully through the lower body, avoiding vital organs so the body would not die too quickly. Victims lived for hours, sometimes days. The pole was often oiled, sometimes heated, sometimes blessed. It pierced, then lifted, then stood, the body hanging like a broken flag of what happens when lines are crossed. The wind would move the limbs slightly, like they were still alive, or still reaching for something they never understood. And yet in this cruelty there was more than mere death. It was performance art with an audience. It was message and mirror. There were stories, too, of eroticism woven into the horror, not the simple, crude fantasies of later centuries, but something stranger. Folklore surrounding Vlad is fevered and complicated. In some, he is a righteous ruler punishing thieves with surgical precision, cleaving justice where none had existed. The eroticism of violence is older than Vlad and not limited to him. And this is perhaps the most disturbing part. Not that he killed, not that he killed so many, but that he did it slowly. We know that Vlad was never a solitary figure. Modern historians try to peel away the myth and find the man, but the myth does not peel, it clings. He would be called Dracula long after his death. And when Vlad died, his body was not found whole. There are conflicting stories that he was betrayed by his own men, and so Vlad remains not a monster, not a hero, something else. He rode beside a saint and died as a demon. That is the shape of his legend, a shape too wide for truth and too deep for comfort. Gilles de Rais, once called the Bluebeard of France, had the blood of knights and the mind of a poet, and in between those things something cracked the people who saw him. His name in chapels he donated to churches, he collected relics of saints, he wrote plays and offered coins to those who sang them. His estate stretched across the Loire like a shadow with banners, but something in him curled inwards. After Joan was gone, when she was captured, when she was burned, when her voice stopped ringing across battlefields, something in him went silent, and from that silence he began to build a theatre not of plays, but of pain. Came back. They were brought to his castle, to a room that was sealed not just by stone, but by silence. There were candles there and altars, and sometimes actors, sometimes priests, sometimes strangers. No one quite knew who entered or left, but they all felt the air turn colder around that place. Did not see a monster, they saw a nobleman, his cloak stitched with silver, his horses fed better than most villagers, his walls draped with silk and scripture. He had been a soldier, he had once fought France beside the girl who claimed to hear angels. Joan, they called her, and he believed in her even when no one else did, especially when no one else did. And maybe that was where it started. Shiloh was not always strange. He had once been brave, and if not kind, then at least full of fire. He fought the English with a fury that made men whisper, others said. He had not died at all, that he had made a pact and walked into the forest and became something else, and in some villagers' parents still wound that will not heal, not just that he fell, but that he fell from such height. He reminds us that evil does not always arrive with horns or hunger. Sometimes it arrives wearing velvet, quoting scripture, feeding birds from its windowsill, say his name. When the night is too quiet and the children are not yet asleep, they whisper, "Do not go near the trees." And the land around them still feels tired, as if it has been listening too long to the prayers no one says out loud. Any more prayers that ask not for salvation, but for forgetting. Bluebeard lives there, and he knows your name. They say he began to lose gold first spending without measure, turning his castles into canvases, tapestries, from the east stained glass, from Italy floors of marble painted with stories of biblical lust and martyrdom. And when the coins were gone, he sold land, and when the land was gone, he borrowed, and when the borrowing turned to begging, he turned to something else, something that did not need money, something that only required children. The boys were taken from nearby villages. Peasants gave them up willingly, sometimes drawn by the promise of work in a noble house, a place at the table of a former hero, and sometimes they disappeared without asking, and never. The accounts that survive are stained by time and fear, and by the hunger of later minds to explain the unexplainable. They speak of rituals, black masses, sacrifices, but those words are always vague. The truth is more physical. The children were abused. Some killed, some vanished, some buried, some burned, their bones mixed into ash, their names erased from every ledger, except the ones held in trembling memory. And what makes it worse, what makes it stranger, is that Guy Lee was not a cackling madman. He was not frothing, he was polite. He spoke Latin and quoted Augustine. He wept when his favorite choir-boy died. He prayed before he hurt them, or after. Sometimes both. He offered incense and wine and apologies. His cruelty wore the face of sorrow. He did not see himself as evil. He said he was seeking knowledge, or perhaps communion, with something older than angels. When he was finally caught, it was not for the murders at first. It was for a land dispute with the church. Petty politics tugged at his estate, and someone pulled too hard, and the floor cracked beneath him, and when they looked closer, they found blood where there should have been dust. The trial was both theatre and exorcism. Nobles gasped, peasants wept, and the court gathered every horror it could name into a single body, his body, and still he did not scream. He confessed eventually. But it was the confession of a man already halfway gone, already dancing with things that do not blink. They dressed it up in Latin, they wrapped it in parchment, but beneath it all was the same old story. The story of a man who fell through his own reflection, who looked into the void not to find God or glory, but to find something that would look back and say, "Yes, you are mine." His execution was public. A scaffold built like a sermon was to be burned, though they allowed him confession and a priest and a final kiss from a child, not his own, and then the flames took him not too fast, not too slow, just enough to let the crowd think they had seen justice and not simply another form of the ritual he had begun. But after he died, the stories did not end. In fact, they spread, they grew, they changed. Some said he had been innocent, framed by jealous clergy or greedy barons. And yet he had once been a knight, a soldier, a friend of a saint. And that is his castles are ruins, now moss creeping through the cracks, children. Laughter echoing through the halls like a memory too distant to believe. He was not the first king to hunger for power, and not the first to hunger for women, but Henry VIII folded those hungers into one body and wore them. Like a crown, his appetite was not only for flesh, but for permanence, for a dynasty that would echo. Beyond the grave, he saw his body as the axis of a realm, his marriages as treaties written in skin, his lovers as scripture, and his children as the final judgment written by a god on his loins. He was broad and golden in his youth, his legs strong from hunting, his smile quick, his mind sharp enough to charm even his enemies. He read Latin, he played the lute, he rode into battle with velvet banners, and beneath that glittering frame there pulsed a certainty that he was chosen, that kingship was not just his right, but his nature, and that his desires could not be sinful if they flowed from the bloodline of kings. When he married Catherine of Aragon, it was with both piety and calculation. She had been wed to his brother first, and so the marriage was both union and inheritance. She was older, wise, devout. She gave him respect, and for a time love, but she did not give him what he wanted most, not just a son, but a certainty that his seed could root in the soil of England and bear fruit that would survive him. And so, as the years turned and her womb remained silent or full of grief, he began to believe that God was punishing him, or that perhaps he had been listening to the wrong priest. Anne Boleyn was different, not just younger, not just clever, but elusive. She did not open herself to him as others had. She made him wait, made him write, made him ache, and in that ache he found obsession. The kind that rewrites law and scripture. He divorced the church, not just his queen. He cracked England in half over the shape of a woman's body and built a new faith to fit the silhouette of her eyes, her voice, her promise. And when she too failed to give him a son, when she gave him only Elizabeth, who would one day outshine them all, he turned the same love that once burned into the cold steel of accusation, adultery. They said witchcraft, incest, betrayal. The charges wrapped around her neck like jewels, turned to nooses, and when she was led to the scaffold dressed in grace and silence, she bowed not just to the axe, but to the world that had made her queen, and then made her ashy. Married again, Jane Seymour, pale and quiet, and finally she bore him a son, and died before she could disappoint him, and in her death he saw something sacred. He buried her with honors, and called her his only true wife, even though he had loved others, even though he would marry again and again, searching, perhaps, not for love, but for control, for a mirror that did not crack when it reflected his face. Anne of Cleves was a treaty, not a temptation, and when she arrived and did not please his eye, he set her aside with gifts and laughter and no blood, and married Catherine Howard, who was young, too young, perhaps, full of life, full of flirtation, and he loved her as one might love springtime before it fades, and when rumors curled around her hips, when whispers spoke of other men, he had her questioned and broken and eventually beheaded. And the man who had once been golden now limped through His palaces swollen, sick, angry, wrapped in fur and pain. His last wife, Catherine, outlived him, tended to him like a nurse. More than a lover, she read to him. She calmed his storms, she buried his past beneath gentle words, and was there when his body finally failed him, when his leg oozed, and his temper broke, and his breath grew short, and his crown heavy, and so his reign is remembered not just for its laws and its wars, but for its women, for the way he bent the world around his desire for legacy, and found instead a trail of blood and daughters and ghosts. And yet it was one of those daughters, Elizabeth, who would take the throne and rule longer and more wisely than he ever did. Henry's story is not simply one of lust or cruelty. It is one of obsession, of the way desire can become doctrine, of the way a single man's need to be remembered can reshape the very structure of belief. And if he had only loved less or ruled more, perhaps history would remember him differently. But instead we remember the 6 wives, the split church, the red gowns and white veils, the iron blade shining in the morning sun. His court was a theatre, his bed a battlefield, and his soul a garden, overgrown with fear and longing. He believed that kings must not beg, and yet he begged in the shape of law, in the echo of prayer, and in the bodies of women who were not allowed to say no. The records say he was buried next to Jane Seymour, in a chapel lit by cold windows and dust. And though his son would not live long, and though his name would be sung with both awe and unease, the mark he left was not just on stone, but on skin, on the wombs. He touched the lives he altered, and the faiths he shattered. That is how power moves, sometimes not with armies or gold, but with a whisper, a kiss, a command to kneel or stand or die. And in that movement, history folds into itself, like a cloak around a throne. The French Valois court did not simply rule, it seduced. The air itself seemed laced with spices and secrets, and every corridor echoed not only with footsteps, but with laughter that ran too long, and eyes that lingered too heavily. In this gilded maze of etiquette and velvet, the body was not hidden, it was displayed, draped in silks, powdered with rosewater, painted like mythological promise. They said the halls were built not just to house the monarch, but to cradle temptation, to feed it with harp, music, and figs and wine that glittered in goblets, as though it held the stars themselves. Banquets stretched from sunset until dawn. And they were not just meals, but rituals, each course a performance, each toast a pact, the meats sculpted into the shapes of animals that had never lived, the sauces poured like molten desire over everything, the servants masked and silent, the dancers rising from behind curtains in nothing but gold dust and feathers, the guests reclining as though history itself had been asked to pause and wait. Outside, these nights were rehearsed like plays and remembered like dreams, but they were real enough to stain the sheets and the scrolls. Real enough that ambassadors from colder courts wrote home in careful code, unable to say what they had seen, yet unable to forget it either. Catherine de' Medici did not invent the sin of her court, but she arranged it like a composer arranging a symphony. She brought with her a knowledge of art and poison, of astrology and deception, her Italy steeped in both saints and serpents. And from that alchemy she conjured a court that ruled not just with swords, but with glances. She formed a coterie known as the Escadron Volant, the Flying Squadron, a group of women chosen not just for beauty, but for skill in seduction, trained to listen to the quietest tremors of a man's voice, to gather secrets in their hair and carry them back like birds bringing twigs to the nest. They were not courtesans, not in the sense of coin or shame. They were extensions of the crown. They danced at banquets, but they also dined in council. They bedded noblemen and foreign dignitaries, not as surrender, but as strategy. And in their wake, the Valois court gathered power, Like a gown gathers dust, exquisite and deliberate, some whispered that they were witches, that they sang spells into the ears of generals, but what they truly practiced was far older than magic. It was the sacred knowledge of what the body can make a man say when his breath is shallow and his armor laid on the floor. These women were not just pawns, though they were queens of their own making, fluent in perfume and politics. They learned which pillow talk could shift alliances, which touches softened declarations of war, and which glances could disarm the proudest duke before the second course was served. And though history rarely writes their names with ink, it scrawled their presence into treaties, into dynasties, into the way France would come to see power, not only as something wielded with law, but with laps yet. For all the velvet and wine there was wrought to feasts that drowned out the sound of famine elsewhere. Debts hidden beneath the weight of golden candelabras, the whispers of lovers turned into blackmail, into duels, fought in gardens, still sticky from the night's pleasure. The court had learned to dance on the edge of a blade, and it did so beautifully until it could not any more. There were rooms in the Louvre where tapestries muffled more than laughter, where the flying squadron might enter a chamber with kisses and leave with secrets sealed behind. Fans there were, fountains that ran not only with water but with wine, and sometimes blood-masked balls, where the masks slipped too quickly or not at all, and where the mirrors showed more than just reflections, but truths to bear, to survive, in daylight, tanned through it all. Catherine moved with the calm of someone who had seen Rome burn and Florence bleed. She knew that power could not always be carried in the hand, that sometimes it must be tasted, exhaled, draped across a chaise, and she taught her children to rule with charm, even when their hearts broke to pieces inside their ribcage. Henri III. Her son held court with equal parts elegance and excess. His favourites, called the Mignons, were draped in pearls and painted with rouge. They flouted the norms of masculine power, and in their silk sleeves carried whispers that unravelled the ambitions of harder men. His court became not only a stage for politics, but for gender itself, fluid and dangerous and lovely, and the nobles gritted their teeth and bowed anyway, for to resist was to be exiled not only from the court, but from relevance itself. Was not that the Valois kings did not fight wars, they did, they bled and commanded and burned cities, but the court they maintained in the in-between moments was a war of another kind, the war of glances, of alliances sealed in perfumed bedrooms, of poison slipped into goblets, not always to kill, but sometimes just to remind that pleasure could be power, and that desire could be a leash, if braided correctly. The records show expenses for feasts so lavish they defy belief. 10,000 dishes for a single event, pearls sewn into the napkins, musicians playing from within hidden alcoves, the smells of jasmine and roast swan mingling in a way that made it difficult to know whether one was hungry or aroused, or both. The clergy grumbled, of course, and so did the old nobles, but they too attended, and they too looked when the women of the squadron passed by, trailing veils like smoke from a candle just extinguished. And when a scandal broke, and it often did, it broke with music still playing, with dancers still spinning. It was part of the theatre, part of the danger, for what is power if it cannot walk the edge of ruin and smile? And this was a court that did not blink in the face of ruin. It invited it to dinner, dressed it in diamonds, and asked it to dance. Yet underneath the silken song lay anxiety, the knowledge that power built on seduction must always be fed again and again, and that those who hold secrets in their mouths risk swallowing poison. The flying squadron too were not immortal. Some were discarded quietly, others married off to far provinces, their usefulness spent and their names slowly erased. They had ruled in shadows, but shadows do not keep monuments, they keep silence. The Valois line was ending its blood. thinning with each brother and son, the wars of religion eating at its edges, and the old nobles murmuring louder, and the court's enchantment began to flicker. What had once seemed decadent and divine began to feel desperate, like a candle trying to burn against a storm, but for a time it had been alive, alive in a way few courts ever dared to be a living organism. Made of whispers and silk and secrets and sweat, when the line finally gave way to the bourbons, the court changed its fragrance, shifted, the flying squadron disbanded or absorbed the banquets. Sobered, the politics became cleaner, or at least more disguised, and the memory of that era faded like perfume on linen. Still faint, still haunting, but no longer potent, but the stories survived not in textbooks, but in murmurs, in the way French still holds on to elegance as power, in the way seduction still dances through its diplomacy, in the way history remembers not just the dates and the deaths, but the nights where pleasure and control became indistinguishable land. So we drift from that court of gold and candlelight, where queens were made of silence, and men lost their swords to laughter, where power smelled like jasmine and blood, and where the greatest secrets were never written down but carried on the skin. The body of a king was never just a body, it was a symbol, a battleground, a map of divine authority, stretched over flesh and frailty and the things that happened behind locked doors, or in candlelit groves, or beneath jeweled ceilings, were never merely personal. They were reflections of rule, of sovereignty, of the terrifying freedom that came with unchecked command, and when that freedom twisted into cruelty or desire or shame, it did not disappear. It echoed across time. It stained the pages of chronicles, it clung to the corners of cathedrals, and whispered from the mouths of poets who did not know whether to praise or to mourn. Power, in its most ancient form, has always leaned close to perversion, not because rulers are born wicked, but because the structures that elevate them above judgment, above consequence, above the soft voice of morality, also insulate their whims. They are taught that their appetite is law, and so they devour until the shape of hunger itself changes, until pleasure fuses with violence, with vanity, with fear, and the court around them learns to nod and flatter and look away, or, worse, to participate and call it loyalty. In the dark centuries, when candles guttered low and ink was scarce, the chroniclers who wrote of kings did so with trembling hands. Some confessed everything using the language of damnation, cloaking scandal in sermons and exorcisms. Others scrubbed away the stains, painting their monarchs in virtue and piety, and pretending the bruises on palace floors did not exist, and there were those rare few who hinted at the truth only in metaphors, describing roses that bled or feasts that ended in silence, and those are the ones we must read most closely, for they have handed us the shadows, if not the shapes. The legacy of royal perversion is not about titillation. It is about structure, about what happens when humans are placed atop pyramids and told that their desires are sacred and their urges beyond reproach. It is about the quiet terror in a servant's eyes the moment before she is summoned to a chamber she cannot refuse, about the silence of pages who carried letters soaked in threat and perfume, about the dancers who were never certain whether their beauty would win them favor or destruction. And yet, amid the cruelty and excess, there was also something else, a kind of tragic poetry. The way the court became a theatre, where love and dominance were rehearsed again and again. The way even the most grotesque acts were framed in ritual, in ceremony, in the soft fold of velvet curtains, as though, if draped in enough silk, even agony could be made holy. And perhaps that was the true alchemy of power, not to create, but to transform, to turn sin into policy, and lust into lineage. When we look at the tales of Charles of Navarre, or Guy de Race, or the Valois masquerades, We are not only seeing madness or evil, we are seeing the results of systems that allowed those men to become myths while their victims became ghosts, and this imbalance, this erasure, continues long after their bones have crumbled into dust. It lingers in the way we teach history, in the way we elevate conquest over cost, in the way we marvel at castles without asking what screams were swallowed by their stones. The medieval world did not separate the erotic from the sacred as cleanly as we might imagine. The body was a vessel of sin, but also of miracles. Saints bled ecstasy, and kings were anointed with oil and crowned with symbols that shimmered with divine implication. And so when those kings committed acts that violated the flesh of others, those acts were not always seen as crimes, but as expressions of dominion, of mystical hierarchy, of the right to touch and take without consequence. But the people remembered. The gossip traveled faster than banners. The markets buzzed with stories, even when the priests scolded and the scribes sanitized. And in those whispered legends, a different kind of history was preserved. A history where kings were not gods, but men, where power was not glory but appetite, and where the bedchamber was often more feared than the battlefield. And still the line between pleasure and punishment remained thin. Rulers like Vlad or Henry used sex as a weapon, a means of control, a performance of sovereignty, and their victims became props in a play of domination. Their screams absorbed into the architecture, their names lost, but their suffering woven into the stories told beneath breath. In hidden corners of the world, the legacy of perversion is also a legacy of storytelling, of how we choose to remember, of who gets to speak and who is silenced. The medieval mind did not see contradiction in a king who wept at mass and violated a page that same night. It understood that power was layered, contradictory, brutal, and sacred, and so it did not always cry out against abuse, because it had been taught that suffering was part of order, that hierarchy was holy, and that the touch of a king, even when it burned, was a kind of blessing. Now we look back through the glass of centuries and wonder at the meaning of those acts. We name them scandal, we name them sin, we call them madness or sickness, but perhaps we must also call them warnings. They are records not just of individual cruelty, but of collective blindness, of what happens when a society teaches that some people are beyond the reach of pain, that their pain matters more, and that others exist only to receive it. There are stories preserved in the margins of monastic texts, drawings of naked figures chased by demons or bound in strange rituals, and these are not just jokes or artistic flourish. They are records of imagination, of fear, of fascination, and of how deeply the erotic and the spiritual intertwined, even in the coldest of stone cloisters, even in the most pious of scriptoriums. Monks dreamt and feared and longed, just like kings, and those dreams stained the parchment with truths we are only now beginning to read clearly. And what of the legacy in our own time? What do we carry forward from those velvet-choked corridors, from the feasts where power tasted like honey and screamed like hunger? We carry the stories, still the fascination, with the intimate lives of the powerful, the endless gaze into bedrooms that do not belong to us, and the strange comfort we take in knowing that even monarchs were monstrous, that even those who wore crowns could not escape the chaos of their own desires. But perhaps more importantly, we carry a responsibility to look harder, to ask what history has hidden, what it has called divine, when it was only brutal, what it has named glorious, when it was only grotesque, and to remember that behind every tale of royal excess there were bodies left behind, bodies that did not become statues or legends, but bones, scattered beneath castle floors. And if we remember them, if we whisper their names, even without knowing them, we begin to balance the scales. This series has walked slowly through those forgotten halls. It has lit a candle in the rooms history tried to lock it. has followed the trail of silk and blood and perfume through a past that was never pure but always human, and as we step away now, as the corridors grow quiet and the torches burn low, we do not forget we carry these stories gently, not to shock, not to condemn, but to understand. The crown has always glittered most brightly when it sits atop a mask, and now we have seen what lies beneath that mask: the hunger, the loneliness, the cruelty, and the strange, aching beauty of it all. And as you close your eyes now, perhaps you will remember a single thread from all that velvet, a single note from all that whispered song, and let it carry you down, down into soft forgetfulness, where kings no longer rule, and candles flicker only for your dreams' good. Night, and thank you for walking with me through the hidden histories where power and desire meet beneath the cloak of time's sleep. Now, where the past can no longer touch you and the stories have found their rest.